Welcome to Wavemaker Conversations. I'm Michael Schulder. Whenever I'm approaching a big story, one that covers a lot of ground, like America at 250, the 250th anniversary of the celebration of the Declaration of Independence, I always like to find a side entrance into the story, something that's not typically done, something that might provide a little bit extra insight. This building behind me, the Nantucket Athenaeum, has one of the most fascinating side entrances into the story of America. In August of 1841, when America was only 75 years old, a black man named Frederick Douglass, who had escaped slavery just a few years earlier, had been invited here to speak to an anti-slavery conference. He was such a hit, so powerful, that launched his career as a primary spokesman of the abolition movement and as one of the greatest American speechmakers and orators. It all began here on this site at the Nantucket Athenaeum for this Wavemaker conversation, which was conducted live at the Dreamland Theater here on Nantucket. One of our featured guests is the dynamic professor of history at Yale University, David Blight, who is probably the foremost expert on Frederick Douglass. His biography of Douglass won a Pulitzer Prize. If there's anybody who can channel Frederick Douglass for this important moment, it is David Blight. So that's the history part of it. I want to take it up to the present, and for that, we were joined by two of the most esteemed journalists in America. Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. He has covered 6 presidents. Susan Glasser has covered politics for many, many years as a veteran staff writer on the New Yorker magazine. Journalism has famously been referred to as the first rough draft of history. My hope here is that the insights we get from this conversation might make us all feel empowered to help write the first draft of the next chapter of the American story. I hope you enjoy. Thank you. We have such an opportunity here in Nantucket to begin the conversation of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence with a historic figure whose turning point came right here on the island. Many of us know that Frederick Douglass spoke right here at the Athenaeum. The year was 1841, and that's sort of where most of our knowledge ends. And David Blight, professor at Yale, you have written the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography. If we could have brought Frederick Douglass back, he would have been our first choice. David Blight, you're as close as it comes. So bring us back to 1841. How did Frederick Douglass get here? Why was this such a critical visit in the life of a man who really shaped our country?
Douglass, of course, escaped from slavery in Maryland in August of 1838 to New York City, then up to New Bedford. Many of you know he lived in New Bedford the first 3 years in freedom. It was from there that he caught a steamer called the Telegraph, along with a large group of Garrisonian abolitionists. His wife Anna was with him that day, which is unusual because she rarely traveled to his speeches and lectures, although this was the first one. They met at the Athenaeum, and Douglass was a mere 23-year-old kid still at this point. He was not an inexperienced public speaker, however. He had started practicing sermons, to be frank about it, and then public speaking, even while he was a slave, among what he called his band of brothers on the Freeland farm. And on the eastern shore of Maryland, they would gather under groves of trees on Sundays, and he would instruct them in oratory and the style of oratory and how to use their voice and their arms and their bodies when they did public speaking, which he had obtained from a manual about oratory. But he was terrified that day here on Nantucket because he'd never spoken to quite this kind of audience. He had spoken to white audiences before at the Bristol County anti-slavery society in New Bedford, and he had been preaching already at the AME Zion Church in New Bedford, very small black church, where they even ordained him, which didn't require a degree, it just required the group of elders saying, "Kid, you can preach, you're ordained." And they did. But that day here, August 11th and then 12th, he spoke 2 days in a row. He did get up. He talked about practically shaking as he did it. And we don't know exactly what he said. There's no text of that first speech, nor of the next day. But there are lots of people later who wanted to claim they had been the discoverer of Frederick Douglass. And they all had things to say about his themes, his style, how he riveted the audience, how he captured them. He basically just told some stories of his youth as a slave. This was a huge convention of abolitionists. Up to 1,000 people came out here. Some of them lived here, but most of them had to come out here on boats, obviously. And this was Douglass's now introduction to this world of abolitionist meetings where they would have resolutions they would speak to or against. And he first saw William Lloyd Garrison in action and the other Garrisonian abolitionist. The following year, on the same date, the anniversary, he came again. By then, he's already a full year experienced itinerant lecturer on the anti-slavery circuit, especially in New England. But that time, they were met with a mob that threw brickbats at them, a mob that broke the windows, a mob that forced them to stop and quit and just go back to the steamers and back to the mainland. Now, that might be seen as a tragedy. However, one of the things Douglass was learning, and he had surely learned in that first year out on the circuit, is one of the purposes of these anti-slavery meetings, gatherings, and rhetoric was to stimulate opposition, even if it meant rotten eggs thrown at you, tomatoes, brickbats. Now, a brickbat could be anything from a piece of wood to a stone to a brick hurled at your head. If a mob attacked your meeting, you were a success, unless the mob wins. And the mob won in 1842. But Nantucket is Douglass's coming out into the broader public as an orator, as a voice in the anti-slavery crusade, and very quickly a voice like no one else on that circuit.
And then let's fast forward to what you have called maybe his greatest speech of all time. 11 years later, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And this is a clip, this is the speech as read by the great late black actor Ossie Davis, actor, producer. Let's play clip number 1.
That I am here today is, to me, a matter of astonishment as well as of gratitude. It is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom. This, to you, is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. This celebration also marks the beginning of another year of your national life and reminds you that the Republic of America is now 76 years old. I am glad, fellow citizens, that your nation is so young. There is hope in the thought, and hope is much needed under the dark clouds which lower above the horizon. The eye of the reformer is met with angry flashes, portending disastrous times. But his heart may well beat lighter at the thought that America is young, and that she is still in the impressible stage of her existence.
David, are we still in the impressible stage of our existence? Are we still young? But more than that, tell us about this oratory.
It's one of the many key messages of that speech that the United States was young, malleable, impressible, that it's not too late. Now, But Douglas does that by delivering a classic version of what we've come to know as the Jeremiad, a name for the Hebrew prophet Jeremiah. That's the prophet warning the people, the prophet calling people to the altar, the prophet reminding the people of their terrible sins, of their deserts, of why they deserve to have their temple destroyed. But this speech opens, of course, with this embrace of the founding, embrace of the Declaration of Independence. He embraces the principles. He loved the four first principles of the Declaration of Independence. He called them the founding principles. But then about 6 pages into the text, the hammer does come down in this speech.
You know what? Before we get into this, just one more short clip number.
I forgot, another clip. Yes,
no, but a short clip which really struck me in terms of how he really gets into the shoes of the audience and of the broader public.
The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did, and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory. They were peace men, but they preferred revolution to peaceful submission to bondage. They were quiet men, but they did not shrink from agitating against oppression. They showed forbearance, but they knew its limits.
Well, first of all, Ossie Davis, I could say is the perfect Douglas voice. We don't know for sure. But Douglas had a baritone, a deep, booming baritone. We know that from many descriptions of him. So that sounds fine to me. That's the transition right there to where Douglas will now move to what, I always fashion the Douglas 4th of July speech, and apologies to those of you who've heard me do it, as a symphony in 3 movements. And I know symphonies tend to have 4 movements. His had 3. But the first movement is that setting his audience at ease, honoring the founders, honoring those principles, the glorious Declaration of Independence. The middle movement of the speech, or the symphony, the much longer movement, is the litany of the horrors of slavery, from the hold of a slave ship, which he makes his audience smell, hear. You can hear the chains. You smell the stench. To later, he describes a slave auction. He makes you see a woman with babe in her arms being sold away. He has that ability few have to make you hear oratory in your senses. And it goes on for about 12 pages of text, this litany of terror and horrible aspects of this hideous system.
And that gives us...
Yeah, there you go. We didn't rehearse, so sorry.
No rehearsals whatsoever. It's better that way. He didn't rehearse. He, in fact, I remember in the introduction of his speeches, what did he say about, I didn't really have any time to prepare this.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's very typical of Douglas.
Is that right?
Why have you invited me here? I'm not prepared for this. I don't know enough for this. I don't have the education. It's such a distance from the Eastern Shore to where I am now. I don't belong here. And then he goes to his text, a completely prepared text, and blows them out of their seats for about an hour.
So the explosion, this is an example of the explosion, and this will be our last clip.
I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you, this day, rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine.
He even uses the term at one point, which is a remarkable move. He says, "Pardon me. Why have you invited me here?" And then he says, what this occasion needs is sacrilegious irony, not just irony, sacrilegious irony. And then he just floats into the 137th Psalm. Doesn't name his text. By the rivers of Babylon there we sat down, and we hung our harps upon the willows, and you demanded of us a song. And he goes on more with that. But you invited me here to sing for you. But I'm not going to sing. I'm going to rip your heart out. And that whole middle section of the speech ends with this painful metaphor of a horrible reptile coiled up at the nation's bosom, he says, about to eat out your heart, which is right out of Jonathan Edwards. I mean, it does Jonathan Edwards one better in Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He's got his audience right here, and he says, there's a reptile about to eat out the heart of your nation. Throw it away, he says, throw it away. And then there's a pause in the speech. You can see it on the page. And the last little movement or section is short. He lets the audience back up. I've always imagined maybe they handed out towels and let everybody dry off from the hailstorm they've just had. But he lets them back up. He said, it may not be too late. It is still possible to save yourselves. These are saving principles of the Declaration. He makes a case for the anti-slavery interpretation of the Constitution, and he ends quite almost unbelievably with a passage from a poem which became a hymn by his now nemesis, William Lloyd Garrison, called Go Sound the Jubilee. We're told, Douglas, at the end of this, 600 people were in Corinthian Hall in Rochester that day. We're all on their feet. I'm not sure the Ladies Anti-Slavery Society of Rochester's committee that invited him were certain they were going to get this speech, but they were all on their feet, and we're told Douglas was still kind of trembling in his hands as he packed up his papers and walked off. But our man was a marketer. He already had that baby printed up and took it on the road to sell it. And the next week in his newspaper, you could buy it for 50 cents a copy or $10 for 100. He knew he had written something pretty good here, and he took it on the road and sold it.
Did he have an impact on the course of America, and how can you measure it? How do you know?
With this speech, we don't know, to be honest. This speech got reprinted a fair amount, and he will later in life hear from people who have read it, and with accolades, with language that only a writer could dream of. But exactly how this may have affected the great crisis over the politics of slavery at this moment is very hard to measure. You can't measure it. But note the date. The context for that 4th of July speech almost tells it all. It's 1852. Uncle Tom's Cabin has just been published 3 months earlier. Half the country is reading it. They can't keep it in print. In fact, I speculate in my book that half of his audience already has Stowe's characters in their heads as they're hearing it. It's an election year. It's going to give us Franklin Pierce, for God's sake. Probably the most pro-slavery northern president we ever had. And it's happening at the very moment of fugitive slave rescues all over the North because of that Fugitive Slave Act passed in 1850. The context for this and the political parties are already beginning to tear themselves apart. He knows that. He doesn't know where all this is going, but if you put the 4th of July speech with any 10 of Douglas's other speeches, and not to mention his editorials, which he's writing every week for his newspaper, he is a voice from the abolitionist side of this story. By that time, political abolitionist story like no other.
So Peter and Susan, you two have, I think you mentioned to me, this is 40 years in journalism? Is that what you mentioned? Practicing journalism for 40 years independently and together as a married couple, which is why we put you on the love seat. Well, so practicing for 40 years, What do you want to learn from David Blight that might be applicable to your reporting and the way you can, sort of give us a perspective on the evolving history of our country?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I have to say that it is great to have a chance to meet your heroes, and it's just spellbinding to be grounded, I think, in history at such a moment, right? If anything, we're used to thinking of ourselves as not necessarily living in historic times. And I think it's fair to consider, what is the chapter that's being written right now. Peter and I often, we're doing appearances, we're talking to people, and by the end, everybody's on the floor. The hammer doesn't wait to come out until the end, right? The hammer confronts us all in the news cycle today from the very beginning. And, usually you'll get to this moment where people say, okay, we agree, but, give us something to be optimistic about. And oddly, I listened to David's account of Frederick Douglass. I think those are the kinds of things that offer us a little bit of, if not, outright optimism or hope, certainly the right kind of perspective and context for this very polarized and difficult moment in American history, because Frederick Douglass in that speech did not say, so forget it. It is amazing. He says it's your country, right? He begins and he says it's your land. This is your holiday. This is your. But then he espouses those ideals. He clearly worships and looks up to the ideals articulated in that Declaration of Independence. And I think that is this sort of moment of optimism and the relevance of that history to us right now.
Yeah, I thank you guys for having us, and thank you for coming on this great holiday. And to be on stage, as Susan said, with David Blight is such a great honor. And I could spend all hour or more listening to him talk, and we don't need to interrupt that too much. I guess the question I would ask David, if I'm allowed to ask a question, is to talk about our cycles of history, right? A lot of people take some comfort in this moment of division, this moment when we seem to be at each other's throats, by remembering that we have been at each other's throats before, and we have come out of it, and then we're at each other's throats again. But this is sort of the nature of our country. If you look back at 250 years ago, once they declared independence, they were still at each other's throats for quite a number of years, trying to figure out where to go from there, right? They were obviously quite a sizable population that was still loyal to the king, to the crown. And even once they had won the revolution, there were vast disagreements about how to structure a government that made sense. The government that they create, the Constitution that we live with today, is premised on the idea that we are divided. It divides power, and it creates a structure that is meant to force us to deal with these divisions and come out of them with some sort of a solution. Doesn't always work, as we've seen. But I'm curious, David, as you spent so much time in this, especially in this Civil War and pre-Civil War period, you hear a lot of people today say, are we in a pre-Civil War period? Is this period like the 1850s? Sometimes I feel like that's an exaggeration, but there's sometimes I think maybe not, that there's something to that. I'm just kind of curious how you see these parallels without overstating or oversimplifying.
Well, I love the question. I thought I was finished here, but I guess not. I love parallels. Historians love parallels, but we know as well as anyone they don't always work. They don't fit. But the 1850s is the template, frankly, because not only do we not have a linear history of progress, I mean, come on, that's what Americans want, of course. Progress is supposed to be in our atmosphere, our bloodstream, our rivers. We're the nation of progress. We always solve our problems. No, we don't. Haven't you noticed? The nation broke in 1861. I mean, it really broke. And it could have broken forever, depending on what happened on the battlefields. And name your favorite place, the Peninsula, Antietam, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, on and on. It had to be reimagined, and it was. In the second founding, which almost all historians call it now, the Reconstruction Amendments, the three great amendments, the first Civil Rights Acts, the Reconstruction Acts. It was a reimagined Constitution. It was remade. The Great Depression challenged the United States to its roots. Could a did we have a government that could somehow revive the society out of this massive economic disaster? Yeah, yes, but it also took a world war. Then there's the 60s. I mean, we broke. We were broken in the 1960s. I was growing up then. I didn't fully understand it. I was in college in the late 60s. None of us fully understood it, despite our righteousness. We were remade again in the great civil rights legislation, some of which has now been essentially obliterated by the Supreme Court. That may have to be done again. Who knows? Take the whole story of women's rights. I mean, that was denied until the 19th Amendment, and then had to be revived again and again and again. In the 50s, Frederick Douglass once said, America is made of its contradictions. In fact, he even added emphasis. He said, all made up of its contradictions. At some point you have to ask, why are we afraid of our contradictions? It's what makes us interesting. Any nation that founds itself on creeds, and we are a creedal nation. That's what the Declaration is. They are secular creeds. And they're not entirely secular. I mean, God is in the Declaration of Independence, only vaguely there once by Jefferson, but John Adams and the Continental Congress got God in 2 more times in the revisions. They weren't going to let Jefferson just have nature or nature's God. But if you found yourself with creeds because you're human, you're going to break them. You don't have to believe in original sin to know that. You just have to live. What's at stake here, that's why I love the question, Peter, is how do we conceive of history itself? Our history, the United States, but history itself. Is it on a path to somewhere?
We have reimagined ourselves into
Several
continuing
times. Yeah.
to live. And so that power of imagination is so important, and the historian's imagination is rooted in facts and yet transcends them. The journalist's imagination, you're not supposed to be practicing imagination, but it's got to shape you to some degree. So I just want to, given the rap against mainstream journalism, broadly speaking today, so I want to ask you to enlighten us about some of the things you've learned that are shaping your perceptions of America now from your actual reporting. It can be one story and how you learned it, from whatever source you learned it from. Anything to give us a window behind the scenes on what's shaping your perspective from your original reporting.
Look, failure of imagination, I think, is a lot of it. In many ways, the last decade in our public life has been a challenge, I think, to our failure of imagination to understand that each generation does have to come to terms with these contradictions. I think, Peter and I experienced Washington as a very, it had become almost a technocratic, kind of post-Cold War capital. There was a sense, that we were just sort of turning the dials on technocracy, right? That we were gonna just, tweak a little bit here and there, that, what difference was there really between the two political parties? We're younger, we're products of that, the end of the Cold War. I was a senior in college in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. And I think, we made the mistake of thinking that our exceptional period in American history was, in fact, going to be the trajectory going forward, right? We're the generation of the end of history. Peter and I had the opportunity to cover, as you said, the former Soviet Union, as, unfortunately, this sort of trajectory from tyranny and totalitarianism to democracy, which we made the mistake of thinking would project forward. We happened to be there just purely by accident, at this moment in time when it became clear that wasn't going to be the case, that the door was shutting on democracy and of our own naivete as Americans. And, you asked for one story very briefly. In that period of time, which was foundational for us, this period of time, the end of the Clinton era, the beginning of the George W. Bush era. And 9/11 happens, and we're based in Moscow as journalists, and we're watching the story of Vladimir Putin begin. Not a story anybody got right immediately, which is really the end of democracy in Russia. We get sent to Afghanistan. We're completely unprepared for this. I grew up in suburban New Jersey. I never heard a gun fired in anger until I ended up covering the Battle of Tora Bora. And yet I would say I learned more about covering Washington and covering America from this period of time in our lives, because I learned about ground truth. And I remember one day calling back on the satellite, big bulky satellite phone, to my editors at the Washington Post in Washington. They said, well, you know, Donald Rumsfeld says we've got them surrounded. We've got Al-Qaeda surrounded. And I said, you know, guys, I'm not an expert on the military. I'm definitely not an expert on Afghanistan. I'm looking at these mountains here, the White Mountains of Afghanistan, and they really look like the Rocky Mountains, okay? Nobody is surrounded here. They do not have Al-Qaeda surrounded. I can assure you of that. The rest, I don't know. And I'll tell you that for Peter and I, it's that experience of being open to different narratives, coming back to Washington, understanding that what is in front of us might not be the story as we understand it. That's been invaluable, honestly. You know, there have been times when I've felt like a foreign correspondent in our own country over the last 10 years because things are happening right now that are outside of precedent. You know, Peter, you can speak better than I can to how the White House and covering the White House has changed so radically in our time as journalists. But, you know, here we are on the 4th of July with a president who made $2 billion last year. That's what he declares, monetizing the American presidency for his own benefit. And, you know, we're living in historic times, and it's not just about what we read in books for me, you know.
I covered every president going back to 1996. Susan and I were in Moscow together for 4 years. All of that brings us to this moment. So you know what's normal and what's not normal among presidents. And by the time that 2016 came along, I had thought that I understood the presidency. I thought I understood the White House. I thought I understood that. And I thought that, by the way, that there were more alike Republican and Democrat presidents than we often think. Yes, they have different points of view on particular issues, but the way a White House worked had a certain rhythm to it, had a certain pattern to it. The issues were mostly very familiar. The range of options are limited, and the way presidents dealt with things was similar, even if they came from different ideological places. And then Trump comes along, and you realize, no, nothing is set in stone. Everything is up for renewal or debate or rethinking, in good ways and bad, and you can decide for yourselves. And we often tell the story about this event we went to in Russia where this Democratic, small d, politician was asked, what is the future of democracy in Russia? This would have been 25 years ago. And he says, well, I'm going to tell you a joke, an old Soviet joke. He says there's a guy who's injured. He's picked up by the ambulance. The ambulance is going through the streets of Moscow. He looks up and he realizes, he says, we're not going to the hospital. Where are we going? And the driver says, we're going to the morgue. And the guy in the back says, well, I'm not dead. He says, well, we're not there yet. The point is that, you know, we are heading someplace. And the question is where? And where do we want to head? And where do we want our story to wind up? And in the last year, we have recognized through our experience in Russia more similarities in Washington than we ever would have imagined, having come from Putin's Moscow. We have seen fear, we have seen monetizing the presidency, we have seen the use of government resources, what the Russians call active measures, to go after opposition. And we have seen sort of the rewriting of that compact that they came up with more than 2 centuries ago, almost 2.5 centuries ago, and we are redefining as we speak, even this week with the Supreme Court, where the limits of power are there limits of power, and how does it work? And so that experience of having been in Moscow under Vladimir Putin and watching how it changed over 4 years, I think is invaluable to trying to measure where we're going today and where we're going to end up.
Michael, may I ask a question of the two
Please.
great journalists? Since you kind of cut your teeth in the 1990s on so many of these questions, from abroad, but then back here, it's the 90s that gave us, I mean, they're older than that, but it's the 90s that gave us all these culture wars that are tearing us apart, that are being exploited. How do you think about that? Because name your culture war. Sometimes they seem invented, sometimes they're very real. Those really exploded on us in that same decade of that so-called Pax Americana, when America was now on its own and it turns out turned on itself. How do you think about that? And is there any way out of it? I shouldn't have added that last part.
That's for you.
Uh-oh. I'm generally of the not the most optimistic person, because I think that part of it is our own sense of complacency as an entitlement, right? This idea that we have this incredible, awesome legacy from the founders, that we got it right? That our Declaration and our Constitution are the models for everybody around the world. So in a way, what Peter and I saw in the 90s, in the 2010s, arguably even, and leading up to Trump, was this sense that other people were taking care of it, that somehow democracy didn't have to be continuously self-renewing, and that it had become more about spectacle. I think the transformation of the media, it's not an accident that fragmenting of the country has occurred in this period of fragmenting of the media. I would date it back a little bit earlier. To me, I think about the 1980s, and I started out covering Congress in the late 1980s, and when I graduated from college in 1990, and I think about sort of the campaign to take down Speaker Jim Wright, by Newt Gingrich, and the rise of Gingrich inside the Republican Party as being kind of call it the prologue or the prototype, or the sort of foreshadowing of the politics that we would, come to live in every day right now. I think what we couldn't have foreseen, and I'm not sure that it was inevitable, frankly. I think our fracturing, the partisanship, that was happening over a broad sweep of period of time. When I was a kid and coming to Nantucket with my parents as a little kid in the 1970s, in the 1976, the bicentennial, something like 20 or even as many as 24 of the states were actually competitive. They were battleground states in the 1976 election, which was a super close election, right? Flash forward to essentially there were maybe 10 states that were competitive states for Barack Obama. And then in Donald Trump's elections, over the last 3 presidential elections, it's 6 or even just 3 states that have decided it. So that was happening over a period of time. Were we destined to have Donald Trump, particularly, and a uniquely, a figure who was both very successful in his demagoguery, but at the same time also uniquely attracted to authoritarianism? That's something that I don't know if we were guaranteed to have, but I do know that, what we've covered is a radical expansion in the idea of executive power.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that's true. And look, where did it start? Did it start with at 94 and the Republican Revolution? That midterm, did it start with Jim Wright? Some Republicans would say it started with Robert Bork, and the Democrats went after one of their guys. Where it starts depends on where you sit to some extent. I covered the Clinton impeachment, the Clinton, Lewinsky story.
We used to say we're the only good thing that came out of that
That's
situation.
when we met. She was my editor on that.
You were his editor on that?
Oh, yeah.
Not technically.
Yes,
I think that's
technically.
important to note.
She assigned me my stories. She edited my stories. That was my editor.
I did write the evaluation.
You marry your editor, but not your professor.
She didn't set my salary.
He's older than me.
In any case, and obviously 9/11 comes along, in some ways refocuses our priorities for a while, right? And we kind of put those culture war issues to a side again, and then over time we get back to them, and they are tearing us apart.
So can I ask you, tearing us apart, this term that I really only started to hear regularly recently, negative partisanship, where you hate the other side more than you like your own side. And that brings me, I do want to sort of open it up to some questions in the audience, but it reminds me of another Russian joke. The Russians are famous for peasants, Russian peasants. You know where I'm going already?
Oh, yeah. It's a good joke.
Well, the joke is, peasants endure a lot of suffering in Russia. Why do they endure so much? Because as long as their neighbors are not doing better than they are, they're fine. So the joke is the genie comes out, grants the peasant the wish, but whatever you wish for, your neighbor's going to get double. And the peasant says, poke out one of my eyes.
Sounds very American, actually.
More and more.
So listen, any questions? Let's start right there. If I know there are two mics coming around.
I was in Congress on 9/11, which was a predicted event. However, it was ignored by most politicians. Not me, but hey, it didn't matter then. And after 9/11, on the day of 9/11, actually, the Capitol had closed. We got it reopened, and the members of Congress who were there stood together on the steps of the Capitol without focusing on political party, held hands, and sang "God Bless America." And the conversation at the time was America was under attack, not the Republicans, not the Democrats. And that moment of unity lasted a little bit. And during the early Bush 43 administration, whether we made mistakes or not, we made a lot of mistakes. People worked together. Congress debated whether to go into Afghanistan, debated whether to go into Iraq, et cetera, et cetera. And then we lost it. And here's my question, 25 years later, but here we have so much interest in the 250th anniversary, so many people coming together. The Declaration of Independence was read this morning in a church, and it was magical to see all those people and to hear the words of it and to apply them to now. Do you think there is a chance that the remembrance of a quarter century after 9/11 could bring this country back together?
And by the way, if you don't mind, for those in the audience who don't know you, tell us how long you served and where.
I served for 9 terms in Congress, and then I ran something called the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars for another decade.
Why don't you all take that, because you're all going to have views.
You'd like to think so, but I don't know that I see that, honestly. The truth is, I mean, look at what's happened since then. We have had a number of moments that were not exactly like 9/11, but were certainly moments where you might have thought we would come back together, right? A pandemic that challenged all of us. The virus didn't care whether we were Republican or Democrat, and yet somehow it ended up becoming divisive. January 6th, the people storming the Capitol were after Republicans as well as Democrats. They chanted, "Hang Mike Pence." It was not entirely partisan. It was against the institution. And the Republicans were as much in danger as Democrats that day. And yet that did not, of course, bring us together for very long. So I think that we are in a different kind of moment. And I don't know what would bring us together. If 9/11 happened tomorrow, God forbid, would we come together? I don't know. I don't know. We have turned this holiday, the 250th, into such a fraught moment, right? Instead of coming together to celebrate our legacy, we have made it yet another partisan moment. We, I say, mainly the president.
Any guidance from an equally or more divisive period?
It would appear to me that the history of these matters tells us, unfortunately, and maybe I went to the same pessimism camp that you did, I don't know, it will take an event that we don't want to happen. I'm sorry. Look at our history. What unifies us? Events we don't expect, we can't anticipate, we don't want them to happen. Our unity will come from some event that forces it. Otherwise, most of us are living, it seems, on the principle, if this be disunity, make the most of it.
I am not usually the optimist, as we've already said in this, but you know, before we end, I want to say something, because I do think we accept these frames, and one of the geniuses of the current president is as a marketer, as a framer, it tends, and I've watched this for a decade, that even where people may disagree, even very strongly disagree with how he framed things, they tend to accept his framing, even if they say, well, it's not right or it's inaccurate. I'm going to just hopefully leave us with this thought that, you know, actually close to 2/3 of Americans right now, they agree on one thing. They don't like what's happening with our current president. They don't like the economic policy of this country right now. They don't like the foreign policy of this country now. And they don't like the actions and the behavior of this president to a remarkable degree. In fact, we're living in a situation where certainly the weaknesses, you could say, of many of our institutions as they've evolved over 2 centuries mean that a minority, even a very unpopular minority, may have control. They may be doing things in our name that do not reflect what we, the people, think. But I actually will say that on this 4th of July, which feels difficult and painful, I do take heart from the fact that almost 2/3 of this country do not like where we are right now, and maybe enough of them will want to do something about it to create their own renewal. So I don't know if that's super optimistic or not, but I'm going to take it as optimism.
Thank you all. I mean, it was really a treat, David, to have you come here to Nantucket, in a place where you brought out the history of this place and taken it in so many ways, in so many great directions. And obviously you, Peter and Susan, who I read religiously. And in fact, I enjoyed listening to you so much, I'm going to resubscribe to the New York Times. Yeah. Thank you all for coming.